Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, 2 months ago, the member for Wentworth told the Australian people that he needed to be Prime Minister to provide Australia with economic leadership. Economic leadership we weren't apparently receiving from the member for Warringah and the former member for North Sydney. He told the Australian people he was going to change things. He was going to turn the economy around. Well, it turns out that economic leadership involves lecturing the Australian people, low and middle income earners, that they have to pay more tax. That's what the economic leadership is, lecturing the Australian people, particularly low and middle income earners, that they should be doing more for his budget. He says he wants a national conversation about increasing the GST. Turns out it's a rather one-sided conversation. Could perhaps best be described as a national monologue from the Prime Minister as opposed to a national conversation, because he lectures, he condescends, he stands at the dispatch box and he explains and lectures about why low and middle income earners should be doing more. But when you ask him a question, he's quite offended to be asked a question about the detail. And we saw it again from the Treasurer today, saying we have no plans, we have no policy, we have no proposal. So it's a national conversation about nothing, Mr Speaker. A bit like a Seinfeld episode, a national conversation about nothing. The Prime Minister and the Treasurer have engineered as part of this new economic leadership for Australia. But when the Prime Minister's lecturing us, he does acknowledge at least one fact, that a GST increase would hit those who can least afford it the most. That's what we know, and that's what it all comes down to. It's regressive. It hits low-income earners much more than it hits high-income earners. The Prime Minister, in his own special way, said that at the dispatch box earlier in the week, he said, so the fact is, whether it's goods that are taxed with a GST or goods that are free from GST, invariably there is a regressive element in it. Well, we know that. We know that, and that's why we're against it, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's the point, because it affects those who can least afford it the most. And let's talk about what sort of impact it will have. We know, because of economic modelling from NatSem, what sort of impact it would have. People in the lowest 20% of income brackets would pay 7% more, but people in the highest 20% income bracket would pay just 3% more of their income. That's regressive. There's nothing fair about that, Mr Deputy Speaker. And we know that those earning around $26,000, who are in the lowest quintile of income earners, will pay $3,000 extra in costs each and every year. And a middle-income earner of around $75,000 would face $5,200 in extra costs. So these are people who can't be asked, shouldn't be asked, to pay this level when the government rejects tax changes and argues against tax changes which would be fair and progressive, and as they've done so consistently for these 2 years. And in fact, the government says, yes, but it's all right because we're going to cut income tax, you see. They lecture. It's OK, we're going to cut tax. Well, the fact is the modelling shows that that would actually make the changes the government's proposing even more regressive. That's what the modelling tells us, even more regressive. And 2/3 of households would be worse off, the average impact being for the bottom 3/4, while it would be positive for the top 2 quintiles. That's what the impact of this government's policies are. And of course, the Prime Minister again lectures us, whether it's glasses on or glasses off, whatever the mode of the lecture is at any particular time. That's OK, because there would be compensation, he tells us. We don't know. We've asked the Treasurer today some of the details, and it's quite clear he doesn't know what the compensation would look like, what it would look like for self-funded retirees, what it would look like for people in remote areas who would be particularly impacted, what it would look like for people who work, but work perhaps casually or part-time and aren't in the personal income tax system. They haven't thought that through. But the one thing we do know is that any compensation delivered through the tax system would be temporary, because what we have is bracket creep. The increase in the GST is permanent. Once the increase happens, once the GST is up, it's with us forever, Mr Deputy Speaker, but the personal income tax cuts would be eaten away by bracket creep, and the Australian people know that. That's why the Australian people are so against this Prime Minister's plans. And we also know that what the Prime Minister would do is put up the price of some things compared to others. And there is nothing, there is no compensation package which wouldn't send which wouldn't deal with the price signal that sends. We know the government likes price signals. The Liberal National Parties like price signals. They tried to put a price signal on going to the doctor, $7 to go to the doctor. They love price signals when they affect people on lower middle incomes. And they're trying it again, except this time what would their price signals do? Well, they'd send a price signal that Australians should eat less fresh food. They'd send a price signal that families on a tight budget going to the supermarket, they want their fresh food to be comparatively more expensive. No compensation deals with that, Mr Deputy Speaker. When you've got 1 million Australians with diabetes, you've got families working hard, trying to do their best to get fresh food on the table for their kids, and what does this Prime Minister do? Lectures them that they should be paying more for it, sending a price signal. Well, then we've got a price signal on education. Never has there been a more important time for Australians to be engaging in self-education and better education. Never has there been a more important time for Australians to be getting themselves ahead by going the extra mile and studying a bit extra, getting themselves some extra qualifications. What's the government want to do? The old price signal. Make it more expensive. Send the signal that you shouldn't be doing that. Exactly the wrong sort of policy, exactly the wrong sort of message to be sending to the Australian people. And of course, health. Again, we know they just want a price signal in health. They've tried so hard. They worked so hard. There was so much effort into trying to make health more expensive. Since the day they were elected, we had the whole Commission of Audit. We had plans to make going to the doctor more expensive. They failed. They failed because the Australian people and this parliament said no, so they're going to have another go. But this time it's through the tax system, by the GST. Now, the government says they need to deliver personal income tax cuts. That's the best they can do, really? The only way they can deliver personal income tax cuts is to jack up the GST. That's how they're going to deal with bracket creep. That's the signal to the Australian people. Well, if ever you want a personal income tax cut, we're going to have to increase the GST to do it. That's all they've got, Mr Deputy Speaker. And of course we were told, not that long ago in the greater scheme of things, that the GST would fix everything. Prime Minister Howard and Treasurer Costello stood there and said the GST will be a growth tax for the states and it will provide the states with the income they need. And they said it won't need to be increased, they said. And in fact, in order to show the Australian people that they wouldn't increase it, they legislated that every state and territory would have to agree to an increase in the GST. That's in the legislation. But now they say, of course, well, we'll go to an election and we'll increase the GST if we win that election. Well, what they'll need to do is amend the legislation if they don't get the agreement of every state and territory. And once that's happened, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's open slather. Every time the government's got a problem, increase the GST. Change the legislation so they can increase the GST whenever they like. Every time they've got a problem, every time they've got something they want to fund, up goes the GST. That's the situation this Prime Minister wants. That's the situation he's going to engineer. So the government says that they need to fix these problems. They need to provide personal income tax cuts, to cut the company tax rate, to make up for their $80 billion worth of cuts to health and education, to abolish stamp duty, to abolish payroll tax sometimes. We hear some of them say. They've spent the GST money 7 or 8 times over, Mr Deputy Speaker. At some point, the Prime Minister's got to stop Turnbull's talkathon and actually announce to the Australian people what this GST money will do. And when he does, they're not going to like it. When he does, he's actually got to come clean with the Australian people and explain that actually all the things that they've been talking about they can't do. They can't do, Mr Deputy Speaker, and the devil's in the detail. And we've got the Treasurer saying it's all right. The tax to GDP ratio won't go up. I'll give you a firm guarantee. We'll only take the same amount of tax. We might take it a bit differently. Well, there goes the compensation, as the Shadow Minister for Finance points out. If you're a pensioner, a carer, a veteran, you're often not in the personal income tax system, and therefore you need some other compensation. If every dollar goes on tax cuts, then there's no compensation for pensioners, no compensation for carers, no compensation for veterans. So either the Treasurer is wrong, which I suspect he is, often happens, or he's planning something very different to what he promises the Australian people. And this is a Treasurer who says Australia doesn't have a revenue problem. He says, well, while he's planning an increase in the GST to jack up revenue. Well, the government says they want a debate. Well, let's have it. Let's have a debate, and we'll have a tax plan for the Australian people to vote on as you will. Let the Australian people decide. If you want a debate on tax, we can't think of anything better. We can't think of anything better than having a debate about tax, because it's a debate where you'll have to show your values to the Australian people, your values and prejudices, Mr Deputy Speaker, which will say we want to increase tax on low and middle income earners. We want to make Australia's pensioners pay more. We want to see Australia's veterans and carers pay more without compensation. That's what your values tell us. You want a debate? Bring it on.